Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Stephen Jast. I'm the president and founder of ROI, Research on Investment, and Gazelle.ai. It's my pleasure to serve as your moderator for today's webinar entitled The Great Reset, Strategies for Our Recovery. Before we move on, let me state the obvious. We are going through an unprecedented event. From a very personal perspective, I'd like to extend to all of you our very best wishes for everyone's continued good health. I'd also like to take a quick moment to thank our panelists, IEDC and Business Facilities Magazine for helping to promote this event, as well as the ROI and Gazelle.ai teams for their hard work leading up to today's event. Let's take a moment to discuss format. This is a 90-minute webinar. We have 5 world-class panelists who will each speak for approximately 10 minutes. We'll have a brief Q&A after every second speaker. Following all the presentations, the panelists will engage in a 20-minute roundtable discussion, followed by a final Q&A, time permitting. Please post your questions in the chat feature that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. This webinar is being recorded, and we'd be happy to make a copy available to whoever would like one. Okay, let's get started. As we consider our recovery, here's what we know. According to the IMF, the global economy will shrink by 3% this year, compared to a 0.1% dip in the Great Recession of 2009. Lost GDP could amount to $9 trillion, more than the economies of Germany and Japan combined. Worldwide trade will plummet by 11% this year. Most governments will be heavily indebted from the expensive emergency relief measures needed to support millions of unemployed workers and backstop thousands of businesses. More than 22 million people have applied for unemployment insurance in the US. That means 13.5% of the labor force is out of work, meaning nearly all the job gains since the 2009 recession have been wiped out in a month. Otherwise viable businesses are facing bankruptcies. Here's what we don't know. We don't know the path that the virus will take. We don't know the effectiveness of policies meant to contain the outbreak and minimize economic damage. We don't know if populations around the world will continue with self-isolation and depressed spending against a potential resurgence of the virus. We don't know what the geopolitical environment will look like post-COVID. We don't know how supply chains will be altered to ensure that strategic goods and materials can be produced domestically when and if needed. And we don't know if governments and industry will seek to decouple from trading partners in sensitive overseas regions. As world leaders grapple with the competing needs of public health and struggling economies, a growing number have begun easing their lockdown restrictions in the past 24 hours. The tentative optimism in parts of Europe and the US about a turning point in the rate of coronavirus infection is encouraging, as more people start thinking about how and when to restart economies. In Australia, 3 of Sydney's beaches were cautiously reopened yesterday. India also allowed some industrial and agricultural work to resume, even as the country recorded its single biggest day rise in coronavirus cases. In Iran, where the outbreak has killed at least 5,000 people, some social distancing rules were relaxed last week, and on Monday, some major shopping centers and inner-city highways were reopened. In Europe, Germany, Poland, Norway, the Czech Republic, and Albania are beginning to ease their lockdown, though France, Italy, and Spain have decided against relaxing measures at this stage. Reopening the economy is a crucial and complex issue involving an unusual range of risks, uncertainties, difficult judgments, and trade-offs. If we continue with the economic status quo, we invite multiplying short and longer-term problems and turning an already unavoidable deep and sudden recession into a financial crisis. Quite frankly, there is risk in whatever we do. Our expert panel will address how EDOs can lead through the business hurdles and opportunities presented by the crisis. We'll also review strategies to achieve stability and long-term growth as we move beyond COVID. We will prevail, that I guarantee. And today is about exploring how we start. Let's take a quick moment to meet our panelists. Dr. Nadine Jeserich. Dr. Jeserich is VP of Analytics at ROI Research on Investment and Gazelle.ai. Nadine received her Ph.D. in Economics from George Mason University and her Master's in Economics and Business Administration from the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. It took me days to practice how to say Maastricht, by the way. Nadine will highlight some of the potential long-term impacts and opportunities for industries and supply chains as a result of the current crisis. Eric Canada. Eric is president of Blaine Canada Limited and author of Economic Development for the Team. Eric is a nationally recognized authority on economic development, marketing, and business retention. Eric will lead us through a review of business data before and after the arrival of COVID and the impact the crisis will have on businesses and workers. Rob Fowler. Rob is the president and CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan. Rob also serves on the board of directors of MyQuest, Michigan's leading entrepreneurial support organization, the National Small Business Association, and the Michigan Health Endowment Fund, where Rob serves as the chair. The Small Business Association of Michigan is the largest private sector membership organization representing small businesses in the U.S. From that perspective, Rob will discuss state-level view of the impact of the crisis on small business and strategies for recovery. Bob Grewe. Bob is the executive director of the Newport Chemical Depot Reuse Authority and manages the operations and redevelopment efforts for the 7,000-acre Vermilion Rise Mega Park. Bob holds a BS and Master's of Public Administration from Indiana University's O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. Bob will discuss the transition of economic development organizations and the impact of the crisis on business retention and expansion, business attraction, and new business development startups. And finally, Dr. Graham Toft. Graham is founder and president of Growth Economics. Graham holds a Ph.D. from Purdue University in public policy and urban engineering. Between 1988 and 2001, Graham was president of the Indiana Economic Development Council. Graham will discuss the importance of understanding your place on the exponential S-curve to survive and flourish in a COVID world. Graham will also discuss how a variety of solutions will be found by America's laboratories of democracy, the states. Without any further ado, please welcome Dr. Nadine Jeserich. Nadine.
Thank you, Stephen, and a warm welcome to our audience, and we appreciate your time today. What I wanted to use the next minutes for was to highlight a few things that made me wonder about what the economy is going to look like post-COVID, both in terms of what we hear from our clients and how companies respond when we ask them about the next expansion project, which is really kind of the core of our business at ROI. The first thing that stood out to me was that there was an increasing interest in acquisitions in the past months relative to greenfield and brownfield investments. Maybe as a way to secure supply chains or especially to quickly enter a new market. Now, we've already seen a significant increase in market concentration across most sectors in the last decade, some more than others. It's not something that's particularly supportive of competition and free market pricing. So is this crisis going to intensify this trend? We also see many smaller and specialized suppliers going bankrupt as their customers put production on hold, and larger companies with cash reserves are trying to future-proof themselves through vertical integration. But where does that lead to small players, and how do we protect them to assure competition, but also diversity of products and services and just plain ideas? More and more businesses are also talking about reshoring. A recent survey by ThomasNet showed that over 50% indicated that reshoring was the likely option going forward. Now, maybe bringing back those jobs right now, especially low-skill jobs, could seem like a at least short-term solution to the kind of unemployment rates we're facing. And together with technology, it could lead to the kind of resilient manufacturing that some people have been talking about. And maybe site selection will really shift from more pure cost-driven decisions to supply chain security concerns. But beyond most likely the strategic sectors and business activities that will apply to, is that really going to assure long-term growth and well-paying jobs? The bottom line is that we have to watch out for our startups and first-time exporters and young growth companies to not get squeezed out of the market even more, and especially in the sectors that are already highly concentrated, and help them understand current and long-term market forces. If you look at the retail sector after the last recession, we've seen a really strong surge in mergers and acquisition up to 2016. So watching the next 3 to 5 months will be very telling. On the upside, and there is an upside, there is a distinct group of businesses that have been able to weather the storm better. Many of them showing up in top growing industry lists at the moment, and on supplier networks like the ThomasNet platform, supporting the cause, so to say. And those are mostly small customer contract manufacturers serving several markets, and the service and technology companies that help support businesses in adapting their production and services and customer models. Now, these companies were already doing quite well in the pre-COVID world, but maybe that is really now going to push us to embrace that adaptable, nimble way of doing business more in all aspects of the economy. Globally, we've seen retail and wholesale and manufacturing basically on a chopping block, according to a lot of statistics. But many of the industries, even within these sectors that have come to the surface in the crisis, they won't just be temporary phenomena serving to supply the healthcare sectors, but I think some of them will persist and represent more long-term structural changes, whether it's health IT, automation finally being accelerated, certain food and pet food manufacturing persisting through the crisis, and cleaning and IT security companies are finding a whole new world to service. I think it truly could lead to, maybe not this year or next year, but soon, another era of product and service innovation and new business models, and companies telling us they're looking for partnerships more and more, and shared spaces, even in manufacturing, as a way to grow. So there's a lot of adaptability in the way business is done over the next couple of months and maybe permanently. The bottom line for me is what changes in policies and in workforce support are needed to make sure we create opportunity out of this crisis. Maybe telehealth will finally solve the rural health crisis. There's one last piece of the puzzle, however. We heard a lot of talk about supply chain disruptions and how to support your traded sector. But even if those disruptions subside and Asia is opening up again, we need the demand side to kick in. The latest consumer confidence index and retail reports are really mind-blowing. And some of the survey results show that supply chain concerns are starting generally to be a little bit less of a concern relative to the start of the crisis, and are giving way to, thinking about the cost of goods, concerns about changes in trade policies, political instability, and mostly where to find new customers. And as a region, it also means that you have to think of the whole value chain of your businesses. Who are their customers and who are their customers? And will they need to identify new markets, and how can you support that? Overall, though, I think another way to approach this situation is that, and the way to think about it is that in many areas and industries, this has just accelerated transformation that was already on the way. So it's not something we're completely unprepared for when it comes to reorganizing the economy. Unfortunately, we just have to kind of skip the learning and transition phase and find a much faster way to deal with these transformations. But just like the studies about automation and AI impacts and all the discussions we had about that in the last couple of years, we have seen that there's opportunities in increasing productivity and wages and US competitiveness if businesses and workers are supported in this transition. Companies in the past year that were able to incorporate more technology and data analysis, they were already ahead of the game. But now it has really become a necessity for all businesses and organizations to embrace this agile way of work and collaboration. Now, part of this process is, of course, understanding where we're at and what challenges we're facing. So I'm handing it over to Eric Canada for some keen data insights. Eric?
Thank you very much, Nadine. Welcome, everybody. It's interesting. Stephen did a great job of positioning what's happened and what the global event looked like. My part of this process is to take it to where we economic developers live and what we operate in, the environment that we operate in. So I wanted to touch on a few things that we've learned as a course of this process. Anybody who knows me knows I have a passion for business retention expansion. It's been what I've done for all these years that I've been in economic development, which is probably too many. But we've done research, we've done articles, we've developed tools like Synchronist and other things. And we've gotten involved in every aspect of business retention expansion, whether it's training or trying to help us learn what the best practices are. But on March 13th, I realized, just as perhaps you realized, that our approach was irrelevant. It just didn't stick anymore. There wasn't an opportunity to do what we've done in the past. The way we would normally react to situations didn't apply. So the question became, how do we respond as economic developers and as people who are involved with Synchronist and my clients and so forth? It occurred to me that it's not just about me and my organization. This is also something about affecting every economic development organization in the country. So I reached out to a few friends on Saturday morning, the 14th, and a few friends reached out to a few friends. And by Sunday afternoon, we had 25 people who had agreed to serve on a steering committee. The steering committee's mission was to where do we start on Monday? What do we have as a conversation for the businesses in our community? How do we learn what they're experiencing given everything that's changing around them? So we wanted to create, as a group, we wanted to create a tool that you could use to benchmark the business and the human workforce impacts in your community. And by Monday afternoon, the steering committee met. We agreed on our goal. We had some draft materials in front of us. By Friday afternoon, we had agreed to a survey instrument, which we now call the Benchmark Survey, the COVID-19 BRE Benchmark Survey. That document was put into place the next day by some of our economic development organizations who were involved in the steering committee because they were on the inside track. So on the 20th, they were out there surveying their companies, trying to find out what the impact was. And by impact, I mean, are you open or closed? How is your capability for producing? Are you at 10%, 50%, 100%? What kinds of capacity do you have? What kinds of supplies are you getting? So we were looking at the very fundamentals of doing business and how they were being impacted. We were also looking at the human side. How many workers do you have? How many workers have you had to lay off? Have you terminated employees? Have you hired employees? Is your business up? Is it down? So we were looking at all aspects of the business impact in this 20-question survey that we put together. And then we distributed it to the universe and tried to encourage everyone out there as an economic developer to use it, not for our benefit, but because it gave you a position at the table. The whole point in this survey process was to figure out as economic developers, what can we bring to the table so that we make sure we're part of the conversation. If we want to represent our business community, we have to be part of the conversation about what's going on in our community. This data gives us a really rich benchmark to be able to bring to that conversation that nobody else has. So it was a tool to create a leadership opportunity for those of us in the profession and to make it available to everyone else. Within a month, within less than that, 27 days, we had over 3,000 interviews, not interviews, but surveys that have been completed and returned to the national team, to the steering committee, to basically be used as national information on this subject. Then we created the dashboard. which was also part of that 30-day process. So we began to see a national picture from a local level, which was absolutely our goal from the very beginning. Some of the organizations that contributed data are shown here. We've got a lot of other small organizations that are in the process. Some are just beginning now because this isn't an even impact. It's not impacting everybody at the same time in the same place. So some organizations are just beginning this survey process, and they'll follow the benchmark survey with the monitoring survey, which was also developed within that 27-day period. The dashboard is, again, part of trying to make your work and make us as professional economic developers more visible to the community as an important part of this discussion, again, to be able to represent our constituents. As economic developers, what were we experiencing in February? Our experience in February was absolutely different than it is in March, obviously, as it is with most companies. Based on surveys that our synchronous users had conducted, if you look at the life cycle status of companies that were being interviewed, 28.6% were mature, 2% were declining, most were growing, 68.8%. Another 6.9 were emerging, or the entrepreneurial class, if you would. Clearly, that shifted within days. At that point, we also, every other interview you conducted almost, was telling you that they had some plans to expand or they were growing their businesses, 42.8%. Most companies, 48%, were telling us that they had trouble finding the workers they need, the skill sets they needed. Many of you had geared up to focus on workforce, recruiting talent to your community and other aspects of helping fill that need for workers. Now, where are we at? If you look at the companies, and one of the key questions on the benchmark survey that the network created was, what's your survivability forecast? How long can you as a company survive with low or no business activity? And if you look at this, this is for under 5 employees. So these are the smallest of companies. And you can see, starting from the bottom, that 38% don't even anticipate their ability to make a month. Another 20% couldn't make it to 2 months. So if you look at this, you're dealing with 65% of the companies didn't have the bandwidth, the capabilities, the resources to manage an extended period of time with no cash flow. If we broaden that out and look at all companies by size across the top, you can see the pattern. Most had very little capability of surviving multiple months. 65%, as I said, under 5, but it's equally bad the 10 to 19 category. And not much better when you get to 75 and 100. 58.9% of the companies with 75 to 100 employees anticipate under 2 months worth of survival capabilities. Now, obviously, they went into panic mode. They started cutting budgets. They started furloughing employees. They started managing other things to try to stretch that period of time. But, the reality is the reality. Now, if you look at the human side of that, you look at the human impacts. Here again are companies by employment size, and we're looking at the number of layoffs. And clearly, the vast majority of layoffs, 54% of the respondents, accounted for 29.7% of the layoffs. The very smallest businesses were killed. They were laying off substantial chunks of their entire workforce. 36% of the respondents were in that 10 to 50 employment range, and they were 33% of the layoffs in this figure. So you can see very clearly that the ones with the best potential, and this really confirms what Nadine was saying, was basically that category of 50 to 100 was sort of the sweet spot. They saw more, they did fewer layoffs as this thing was occurring. Clearly, this is something bad. It's happened. We obviously have ways to respond. Dr. Seuss says we can either let it define you, we can let it destroy you, or we can let it strengthen you. That's clearly an opportunity. If any of you are familiar with my portfolio strategy for business retention expansion, there are 4 quadrants of the portfolio of the companies in your community. You've got the dogs on the lower left, you've got the base companies on the lower right, you've got the entrepreneurial class in the upper left, and then you've got the growth companies in the upper right. And the companies that are most likely to survive this are your base companies, the companies that are forming the base of the community, which means they're slow growth, which means they have a lot of employees, which means they're basically baseline companies. Your growth companies are highly at risk because they're the ones that have been putting their resource into growing the business, not into the bank to survive something like this that was totally unanticipated. The weak ones in the lower left-hand quadrant, of course, have all the challenges weak companies have, and they're the ones that don't survive the month. So depending on your portfolio and how you had packaged it before, you have some sense of what's going to happen to your community as we pull out of this. So the final comment that I'll make comes from Bob Marley. You never know how strong you are until strong is your only choice. That is our choice today. We have an opportunity as economic developers to really become leaders at another level in our community, and I wish you all the success in doing that. I will now turn it back to you, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Eric. So we'll take a couple of questions now before we move on to our next 2 speakers. So Nadine, there's a question for you. So what industries should we pay attention to now and try to grow? And part 2 of that question is, when is the right time to start business attraction again?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And that's, it's a question that, of course, we hear a lot from our clients as well. Now, the definition of what is a high growth industry or company and what is the right fit for your community was, of course, already a challenge before the crisis. We deal with it on a daily basis, and it's not an easy one to answer. And it depended on the stage of the business and how it fits into your ecosystem, whether you have the supply chain, of course, also whether you have the incentives, and of course, more importantly, whether you have the workforce. It just has gotten a bit more complex. On the one hand, you can track national, international trends. I mentioned some sectors earlier that seem to jive well with the agility we will need from businesses going forward. Eric mentioned, certainly the kind of mid-market companies have some strengths, but we still have to wait for the dust to settle a bit. But I think, for me, the rule of target what you can support still holds. You don't have to toss out your whole rule book. You have to keep a close eye on diversity in terms of size of companies and industries. Maybe research a bit more whether you're prepared for another downturn in terms of counter-cyclical and pro-cyclical industries. But I think in the end you have to be able to support them. The support they need will be more complicated with new companies coming in. They will need to know how strong your healthcare sector is and how supportive you are of different workforce safety protocols, and how you can support them in finding new staff. That is, still, of course, again, as Eric's data showed, a question. So I think, the basis for business attraction and even for identifying target industries is still the same. You can't suddenly all become healthcare clusters and hubs just because at the moment that is trending well. You still needs to be tied to your fundamentals.
Okay, great. Eric, how does the BRNE COVID-19 Response Network help business, and why should I participate?
The way it helps business is to get the business voice represented at the table. And that's, again, our local economic developers being able to bring good data to the table about what's happening in the business community. Everybody's operating off of anecdotes, and everybody has a cousin who's in business or a friend who's in business that's struggling or may not come back. So that's a real challenge, but business has to be represented at the table, and we speak for them. It helps us and people are still doing the survey. Some are still doing the benchmark survey. Others are later in the game, and they're doing now the monitoring surveys, which are done every 2 weeks after the initial survey. So people are in various stages of that, depending on when they started. People are still hearing about the survey, and we want anybody to use it that will feel that it provides them some utility and some advantage. It's not too late. When you bring data to the table, you have value that you're contributing, you're representing your constituency. Lakeshore Advantage has been monitoring this. They were one of the early out with the benchmark survey. Then they've done their monitoring survey every week for the last 4 weeks. And their business community started asking them, well, what are you hearing? What are you hearing? What's going on? So they now put out a weekly newsletter to update that. They've just packaged all the information they have, and they went to the governor and said, speaking for our businesses, this is what we need from you. And they had the data to back it up. So give your companies a voice. But having said that, we also understand that we talk about this as if you're not impacted. And we know that every economic developer on this call has an organization that's being impacted, maybe not at the current moment, but maybe 6 months from now, and maybe beyond that as we move forward in this. But data brings us to the table. It brings value to our companies.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Eric. So we'll move back to our speakers. So Rob, are you ready to go?
I am ready.
Okay.
Thank you, Steve.
Everybody? Sure, Rob Fowler.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate the opportunity to sort of bring a small business perspective, maybe from a state perspective as well. A little background. I represent an organization called the Small Business Association of Michigan, statewide independent chamber of commerce-like organization, meaning we have members. We have about 28,000 members, makes us the largest small business organization in the country. Much of what we do is advocacy, and I think we do traditional business advocacy, meaning I'm a registered lobbyist for businesses here in the state of Michigan. But the voice of entrepreneurship and economic development, that intersection, I think we are sort of unique in that. Many of the other business organizations don't spend much time in that space. We also do services and group purchasing, health insurance, and that sort of thing for our members. So kind of an all-around small business organization. We are not the SBA. I feel like it's always important to make that distinction. We're sometimes confused. The SBA is a federal government agency, and I would say parenthetically, especially right now, I don't want to be confused with the SBA because they are having some real issues. But I thought maybe I'd set the stage or set the case here a little bit, just give you Michigan's experience. It'll be like some others and unlike some others. Just the timeline of this, on March 16th, the day before St. Patrick's Day, to get ahead of what would have been probably a lot of people up close and personal in bars and restaurants, Michigan's governor closed all bars and restaurants by executive order. That was followed the next week on March 24th with a full stay home, stay safe executive orders, as people are calling it, a shelter in place. It's a very comprehensive. It uses the Department of Homeland Security so-called CISA list, or the Critical Infrastructure Security Administration list, which tells you specifically who's critical infrastructure and who is not, what companies are and what companies are not. Even at that, there's a fair amount of ambiguity in it, but there's been a little evolution of that CISA list, and so Michigan still is focused on the first iteration of the CISA list, which is more restrictive. So we have one of the more restrictive definitions of industry, critical industry, or those are essential in the country. We also have this sort of unique position. We are the third highest right now in COVID deaths, and we are the third highest in unemployment in the United States. Somebody mentioned earlier 22 million unemployed as a result of this. Well, 1 million of those are in Michigan. So we've just crossed over 1 million uninsurance claims. I'm fairly certain that there's a fair number that have not made it through the system yet, and that number doesn't represent all those who are out as a result of this. Our executive order goes until April 30th, and we have just joined with 6 other states, and it's looking very much like May 1st. At least will be the beginning of a new phase. I don't think anybody thinks we'll just everybody goes back to normal, but I think it'll be the beginning of a new phase. Let me talk a little bit about just the impact on small business. We have a survey that actually we're just releasing today. 1,300 small businesses in the state of Michigan. Some of the highlights: 44% of them are closed as we speak. 44% are not considered critical infrastructure and therefore required to be closed. Of those, 14% of them believe that they are not likely to survive, and 4% expect to be out of business by the end of the year. So I think and as I look through the survey, it's as bad as we think. Also, I think what we've seen is that there are some winners and some losers. Some are very, very fragile. 75% of businesses in a recent Harvard Business Review post-COVID survey said that they have less than 2 months of cash on hand, 2 months of runway to stay in business. We know that there are some winners and some losers. As somebody said to me recently, we have restaurants and we have toilet paper factories. And we have everything in between, and certainly some are thriving during this, but many, many are struggling. One of the things we're seeing is an unevenness between even large stores who can sell a little bit of everything because they sell groceries, and therefore they can sell greeting cards and potting soil, while smaller retailers who sell greeting cards and potting soil can't be open. And so there's just sort of this heavy burden that's landing on small businesses, kind of uniquely in many ways. Let me talk a little bit about the current resources that are available in the state of Michigan, but I've seen some other states respond in like ways. The Michigan Economic Development Corporation put $20 million out in what is called the Michigan Small Business Relief Program, distributed through local economic development organizations across the state. It didn't go very far, but it was gone quickly, but it really was aimed at some of the early companies affected by this. Also, our unemployment insurance has been overrun. The website's been down several times, but overrun in many ways by independent contractors, sole proprietors, sort of the gig economy, people who haven't been through this before and never were able to claim unemployment. At the federal level, I think the biggest issue, the biggest asset is the Paycheck Protection Program. $349 billion. That money was consumed very quickly. There's talk as early as today that the Congress of the U.S. would put another 300 or so billion into it. We've been basically saying to our members, if you don't have attention for anything but one thing, pay attention to the Paycheck Protection Program. That's the one that we believe can be the lifeline for small businesses. The other one is the economic injury disaster loans, originally $8 billion through the SBA, and we understand it may be also funded up to $50 billion in this next round. So those two are the sort of immediate term assets or resources available to small businesses. How do we recover? I think is one of the obviously questions that's on everybody's mind. And when do we recover? Our governor's actually on. We've been doing a daily briefing, and our governor will be on our daily briefing today. And she's begun to talk about the when and the how of recovery. And we're hoping that she'll give us a little more insight today. She's convened something called the Michigan Economic Recovery Council, made up of CEOs of large companies. The chairman of our board is also on that, representing small business. And so it's a voice in the governor's ear that sort of counterbalances, frankly, the public health voice. And they have really been looking at this three-step phase back in. I think that's what we all expect, that based upon some geography, some better definition of essential and non-essential work, and the risk profile of industries, that we would begin to see a layering back in. Our hope is that that our economic development, Chamber of Commerce, small business organizations really push the availability of this PPP. We believe it's really, life-changing for some businesses, and they really got to pay attention to it. I'm going to come back to the startup and acceleration landscape in questions if possible, but this is an area that we really want to focus now is, what is it going to look like in that space? What should it look like? We think there are going to be lots of opportunities in change, and that an entrepreneurial economy and an entrepreneurial community might be well positioned to really understand what kind of opportunities come as a result of some of the changes that Nadine talked about and others. And finally, I just want to suggest that when the dust settles on this conversation, we need to do some pretty serious look back. One of the best leadership experiences I ever had was something called a staff ride, which is based on a Civil War discipline of sort of revisiting the battlefield after the battle was over to understand what lessons could be learned. And I hope that we will do some after action assessment, that we will really understand what it's going to take to recover from this. We need to balance the public health voice with an economic development and a business and economy voice. And seems to me that one of the things we really ought to be paying attention to is the entrepreneurial startup culture. It's probably not the lane that a lot of traditional economic developers have spent time in, but I think Eric sort of alluded to this. We're probably going to have to really understand where jobs are going to be coming from and lean into that space. And I think from my perspective, next slide, please. From my perspective, the real lesson learned is you just can't turn on and off an economy. I was on a call with a doctor from the University of Michigan earlier today, and he said, if closing the economy is an amputation, then restarting it is brain surgery. And I think the restarting of this economy is really going to be the issue for us. So I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Okay, that's great, Rob. And Bob Grewe is our next speaker. Bob, you ready to go?
Pretty sure Bob is muted.
Oh, hello, everybody. The quality of life to life support topic. I'd like to mention that the EDOs have evolved a great deal over the course of this recent economic expansion period, and who would have thought 5 years ago that EDOs would be focused on people attraction and quality of life pursuits, and now we find ourselves fervently working to sustain our local economies and businesses. EDOs are going to have to evolve quickly. Rob kind of pointed to that. We need to retool and gain new competencies that's going to help our businesses remain viable and compete for what at the outset here might be very limited new economic development activity. EDOs need to look at their value proposition. During the expansion period, some EDOs were questioned about their value when we had full employment. I submit that we really need to take time and develop recovery plans and articulate your organization's importance to leading economic recovery efforts in your community. And a related topic is with your allies. Clearly, there's a number of organizations under the economic development umbrella, and it can be a big tent. And right now there's no time for silos. We have to have brutally honest conversations with our partners about structuring effective local recovery teams and who really has the capacity and is best suited for addressing this whole list of new challenges that we'll be facing together. Curious about business attraction and any new priorities for that pursuit. Will we be touting the capacities of our local health department and how many test kits we have and how many skilled professionals we have and what our healthcare facilities are capable of? Will we be touting pro-business public health policies or deeper and different incentives to stimulate economic development? In the end, we'll simply have to monitor and pay close attention to our businesses and be prepared to work on the guidance that they provide for us and how to create new jobs and investment. And advocate for your economy, be the voice. I think we're hearing support a balanced approach to recovery and public health. I think EDOs are well positioned to monitor and stay up to date on the countermeasures and related resources that are being developed to help with business recovery while still maintaining public health goals. Some thoughts here about BR&E. Here in West Central Indiana, our regional efforts were solely focused on attraction. Terre Haute Chamber assumed a leadership role there and provided a regional perspective by businesses by conducting those business surveys at that scale and identifying specific business needs. These requests were transferred into a simple Google worksheet where our recovery team could look at those needs and address them and document how they provided support in addressing those needs. Very simple, but very effective. Being a convener, please don't assume that your businesses are talking to each other. In this time of global scales and supply chains, they may not be. They've got their other peer groups. However, in times of crisis like this, I believe businesses value connecting with the business professionals in their same location who are having the same experience. I think EDO should consider creating online platforms for those businesses in your communities to connect and share challenges and solutions. We did this in the 08-09 time period with the Great Recession and got very positive feedback on those pursuits and creating those opportunities for conversations. A dashboard, we all like something to navigate from, and clearly the conventional economic data is going to lag, so look for opportunities to create localized data to monitor your local economy. Perhaps a quick survey, weekly or biweekly, that can capture a snapshot of the economic conditions in your community, who's open, who's not, what's the employment situation look like. Clearly reach out to Eric Canada, who provided some insights as an expert in this same area. In our toolboxes, during the expansion period, we saw a lot of stuff come across our desk, and we may not have given it the attention that we should have. Now is the time where we need to revisit, fill, and expand that toolbox and connect with those providers. One of my favorites in this space is the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, NEP program. Purdue University hosts that here in Indiana. I think they're going to be a resource for addressing public health concerns in the workplace and rethinking and re-engineering operations that can work in this new environment. Reaching out to MEP, they noted that they are converting many of their training programs to web-based delivery platforms, but notable that they're realizing simple training challenges, such as trying to find someone who will provide them a space, a library, a school, et cetera, that worked in the past for training because of the inherent supposed risk of accommodating group gatherings. Another resource that I've found effective here in Indiana, a web-based portal that connected businesses with suppliers. And initially, this portal met with limited success, but I believe now with the conversations about realigning supply chains, platforms like these are going to be sought after and can really help to localize and improve these supply chains. Last two thoughts on VR&E. One, make every effort to consolidate your recovery communications with your businesses. So many of us out there putting out so much information. To the extent we can consolidate that, I think it's helpful. And secondly, ask for feedback on everything you're doing. We're going to be throwing so much against the wall. Make sure we're getting feedback and direction on what is adding value to our efforts. My last slide here is on business attraction. Alternatives to travel and meetings, we really loaded up on that space, and we're going to reinvest that money into creating some digital platforms. It's noteworthy that in a few short weeks, we've all been forced into using these web-based meetings and becoming apt at that. I think we're going to continue to foster those same relationships with the site selectors, economic development consultants, commercial realtors, and I suspect collectively we're going to evolve and find new economic development growth strategies. I wanted to note rural areas. We're in a very rural area. It's curious to me if this public health crisis might result in rural locations being preferred or at least given greater consideration for industries looking to have rural locations as part of a diversified portfolio of suppliers and operational facilities. I think we're going to consider incorporating that into our messaging. New business development, we've talked about this. Disruption creates opportunities. This is a disruption like no other. It's likely that everything will change in some manner. Innovation now more than ever is essential. The moonshot, the internet, all these things have spawned new products and services. I'm already seeing numerous examples of this on my LinkedIn account where I'm seeing new ideas for personal protection and new ideas to help businesses ensure employees are practicing social distances. And EDOs are going to have to consider increasing their skill set in this area and revisit those entrepreneurship networks and resources. We really need to purposefully promote and encourage innovation as an essential component for businesses to recover. And these innovations don't have to be groundbreaking, but they will measurably increase the competitiveness of your businesses and help them secure, again, these maybe limited new business opportunities. So host some events, share resources on this, get people thinking about it. Eureka Ranch, an organization out of Cincinnati, Ohio, works in this space and might be a primer on this. And my last thought is an article that came out from Indiana University Business Research Center. I have the URL there. Measures the capacity of your region to realize entrepreneurial development. And again, it might be food for thought as you ponder this entrepreneur innovation space. So that concludes my remarks, Stephen.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks a lot, Bob. We have a couple of questions here before we move on to our final speaker, Dr. Toft. So a question for you, Rob. Are there adequate resources and strategies in place for small business recovery? And as a part two to that question, what is the role of state and local economic developers in small business recovery?
Yeah, so I kind of feel like the answer of are there adequate resources has to be divided into some time frames. I think in the short term, the Paycheck Protection Program in the U.S., what states are doing, those are sort of quick recovery, almost emergency kind of funding. I think in the medium term, I worry a little bit about whether consumers are coming back and how quickly. I worry about whether people are going to be spending money and doing the things that that businesses need them to do in the medium term. And I think in the longer term, and this really kind of gets at maybe what is the role of state and local economic developers. We've embraced a philosophy known as economic gardening. And I like the strategies around economic gardening, but I like the metaphor just as much. It is a grow your own, they decide what kind of business they're going to start and what area it's going to be in. It's not about trying to build a cluster. It's not about building an industry out of nothing. It is letting the entrepreneurial community run and then supporting them in every way you can with acceleration services. I point two resources to people. There is a website called youreconomy.org, hosted by the University of Wisconsin. Youreconomy.org gives you a good way to look at where the jobs come from in your state or your community. And among other things, it will tell you, for example, in Michigan, if you take all the jobs created by companies who moved here, and you subtract away all the jobs lost by companies who moved away, it's nearly a net zero proposition. And the same is true for startups versus failures. So I guess I would just say the real jobs, at least in Michigan, come from those second stage businesses, companies with 10 to 99 employees, 1 to 50 million in sales. Focusing on that space, I think, is really the entrepreneurial space, and looking at those acceleration services like mentor matching and CEO networks and consultant connecting and equity finance and some of those sorts of tools, I think, are what it's going to take.
Okay, fantastic. And Bob, we've got a question for you as well. How can economic development organizations address potential reduction in financial support for their organization? How can EDOs pivot to address new priorities?
I think with the financial support, we're all versed in that. Every organization has dealt with that. And I think it's financial support and maintaining capacity. And some of it is, of course, practical, that you're going to, maybe redirect any available funding, and you're certainly going to reduce costs if that's staff and related overhead, and see where you could share expenses with peer organizations. I think one of the more important thing I mentioned in my remarks was, creating that new value proposition. There'll be an instinct from board members or whatever to relax dues or somehow reduce fundraising, and we get that, but I think we clearly need to people understand the value that we'll bring and go ahead and make that ask, even if it has a reduced level. Make that ask. Maybe take a page from IEDC here and what we're doing right now. Provide opportunities for sponsoring organizations in your EDO to engage members via platforms like this, via webinars. And think about utilizing volunteers. If there's some furloughed workers out there that want to continue engagements in the business community, maybe there's a way to bring those on board and, again, add capacity to your organization. And back to other revenue streams, I recall in other times when large federal dollars rolled out, sometimes there were administrative fees in there that EDOs could look to and utilize. Another consideration might be tapping money that could be dedicated for other purposes. But in this day and where we stand right now, this might be considered an emergency. I think of TIF money that in Indiana is not normally used for administrative fees, but maybe some of that could be used to help keep staffing levels up right now. And in pivoting, again, I think it's back to adjusting that work program. and going from maybe a priority in business recruitment to BR&E, and aligning the staff. You may need to get up to speed on some things quickly and look to find that training, and be critical of all these changes. I think we need to continually, much like ask for feedback, is what we're doing being effective and adding value, and continue to have that dialogue with our stakeholders and customers. So those are my thoughts there, Stephen.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, Graham, are you ready?
Yes, I'm here. You hear me okay?
Okay, excellent. Yeah, you're up.
Good afternoon. Okay, good afternoon, all. My job is to tease you to think about where we're situated right now. I can't move this forward, Steve. There we go. Okay, takes a little second. Where are we right now in the COVID? Let's call it the COVID war. And how do we look at it from the point of view of economic developers or business developers? The last couple of weeks has been very significant in terms of a change of positioning at both the federal level. The federal level, of course, the president has been asking for us to think about moving to opening our economies. And at the local level, the state level, you've got a quote here from Governor Cuomo on the 13th of this month saying, it's not just a public health plan anymore. It's not an either or. If you hear the news from this week, you'll hear about Governor DeWine in Ohio saying he's going to open up his economy May 1. I believe Governor Whitmer is talking around about the same time. Governor Holcomb last night in Indiana announced some relaxation of elective surgeries regarding essential services. Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina all have statements this week about opening up their economies in some form or other. So what is this? What are some lessons we can learn here as we go forward? A first lesson, I seem to move forward very easily here, Steve. Can you move me forward? There we go. Firstly, let us never forget the power of the exponential curve, because we're going to have to come back to that to understand where we are in this particular time period. The exponential curve, of course, is daunting relative to other kinds of mathematical equations. But how does it end? It ends because normally the stimulant there loses some food or habitat, and so the curve starts to round off, what we call a logistic growth curve at the end there, the S curve. We are now looking at positioning most of our states and localities up that upper end of the S curve. I don't seem to move this very easily. Could somebody do that for me? There we go. Second lesson we need to think about is we have a tendency in the United States to think we can solve all our problems. Actually, there's a lot we can learn from what's happened before us. There's some snapback circumstances that we have in front of us from the last 2 months in Wuhan. 83,000 cases, nearly 5,000 deaths, basically back to normal in 2 months. We have Taiwan, even though it was predicted to be one of the most severely impacted countries by the World Health Organization, has experienced just 425 cases and 6 deaths, with, by the way, a recent spike again. Then you've got Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Australia, all have instructive information that can give us in terms of coping with this particular point we are at on that S curve. Singapore, for example, right now has relaxed its rules somewhat, but is now experiencing a spike of 1,000 new cases a day. So this is learning on the run, and it's learning from everybody else as well as learning from ourselves. Can you move me on there, please? I don't know why I'm not moving. Okay. The third lesson is never underestimate our laboratories of democracy. I don't know whether you remember back to early political science classes you might have heard of Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice, who basically suggested that the United States federal system is a system where states have autonomy to develop laws and policies, create them, test them, and then they can be transferred to others in a manner somewhat similar to the scientific method. This became a very popular proposition in the 80s, in the Ronald Reagan era and so forth. But we are still laboratories of democracy. And what I've done here is showing you 5 different ways in which the states already have behaved differently to the circumstances to this point in time. There's one state that has done everything, basically banned everything. Stay at home, no school, travel ban, etc. Okay, I need to, my battery is running low. You might want to plug in your PC. Okay. What's running low there, Steve? Are you there?
Graham.
What's that?
I think you're still fine.
What's that?
I think you're still fine to go
Okay.
and continue along.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Going back to the previous, going back to the map there. There we go. Interesting in this map is that that different parts of the West and the East Coast have taken a much more rigorous position in terms of the policies they've implemented, whereas the middle of the country, the yellow areas, mine is flashing back all the time. Can you see that? Hello?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Erica, if you're listening, can you advance the slide? One more?
Yeah.
There we go. Is that the one you wanted to look at? Right?
Yeah, this is the one. You can see a very interesting pattern here in the United States of states at both coasts, essentially, especially the Great Lakes states. All are have been imposing stay at home, no school, no travel ban, but a ban on non-essential services. Yet in the middle of the country, there are states, 11 in all, who have no home restrictions. They still have banned school, no travel ban, and no business ban. So you are working in a state that has come to this in a very different set of policies. And what the challenge is in economic development is to work out what the different steps we can offer to help the state move ahead as fast as possible. Those states that are in the yellow areas are the states that are predicted to be the least ready to change to a open market economy right now. They're the ones where the Institute for Health, IHME, at the University of Washington, comes out with regular estimates of when you're ready to open up. These are the states who will be, in effect, more ready to open up in a month or two, whereas there's several states in the Midwest, for example, that are ready to open up right now. Let's take a look. Can you move me on one there to the lesson 4? Then how do we set reset points? We're in different circumstances in different parts of the country. Here's Here's a graphic I'd like us all to go away with and keep in our back pocket. This was Denver in 1980, the 1918, the flu epidemic then. This is a community that was experiencing extreme stress. You can see from the first peak in the curve, they started to improve, but then decided that they were ready to open up their economies too early. In other words, their deaths per 100,000 had dropped, but had not dropped significantly. They did not realize how important they need to drop. In Wuhan, they worked on the principle of getting down to around about 10 deaths per day and below before they made the big move. That's how significant this kind of exponential function is, and consideration to the power of this virus. So keep that in mind, that it's probably better to be on the conservative side and look at maybe 1 or 2 weeks ahead of the predicted date that the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation has come up with. Let me give you an example. We can move on to the next one there. In the Midwest, go back one, please. In the Midwest, we have 3 states, Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, all on the second bullet there, all the S-curve will pretty much be over by the middle of May. May 14th for Michigan, early June for Ohio, Indiana, and so forth. The containment strategies are as recommended by the IHMEA are fairly similar in terms of dates. So what these governors are proposing is to open up their markets around about 2 to 3 weeks before a recommended containment strategy be introduced. It's in that time period, I believe, that economic developers and state chambers and so forth and local chambers can do their very best to help businesses prepare, to help the health professionals better understand the kinds of initiatives that would be possible for them to introduce in order to enable an early re-entry into the market. Finally, the fifth lesson is one that we've heard from several, if you can move on to the next one, from several of the speakers so far, and that is that, if you can move on one more, because I'm looking at the time here, don't forget that our job more than anything else, apart from helping firms adapt and rebound, is to prepare our areas for growth. Regenerative economics is really a fundamental element of the U.S. economy. And every time we get impacted by something as significant and as serious as this, we face the prospect of a new normal. And in fact, in this case, it might be quite abnormal, as Nadine is suggesting some of the possibilities. It always happens from the bottom up. So this idea of laboratories of democracy is still at work. We've got to find ways in which we build partnerships, even in more creative ways than we have in the past, to do this at the local level, with other nonprofits, with state agencies, and of course, for the first time ever for many of us, working with health professionals who don't really understand the economic aspects of this very much at all. And it's one of the reasons why we've got ourselves into a case of indiscriminate demand destruction in this economy, because they've imposed burdens on our economy that they fully didn't understand the consequences thereof. With those comments, Steve, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Graham. So that concludes the individual presentations by our panelists. We are now going to engage in about a 10-minute roundtable discussion, after which time we'll try and open up the floor for some additional questions, given that we have enough time. So Bob, I have a note that I'd like to start off and have you perhaps start off with some comments. Do the different state responses have the potential to create economic winners or losers or significant competitive advantages to recover sooner?
Yeah, that is the question. And, Graham kind of pointed to some of the implications of that and whether or not pulling the trigger too soon on reopening. I can't help but think that there'll be some measure of perception of possibly this pro-business positioning. On the other hand, if it backfires, much like Graham showed in Denver in 1918, it could be terrible and create a terrible reputation for a given area. So it seems to me a strange bit of a gamble right now. Anybody else have any thoughts on there on the panel?
I'll take it a bit of a different direction. I think before we think about opening up locally, we've got to think about our organizations and our organization's health. And, clearly we are impacted, just like your organization is, Rob. We don't know the nature of that yet or the extent. But I think we need to think about this may be the end of the economic development organization as a specialty unit. One strategy per organization may not be fundable. If you go back to Bob's comment on the value proposition, we're going to need to think innovatively about how we might restructure our organizations to play a broader role rather than stay in that specialist posture that we had the luxury of doing before. So I think we're needing to see innovation at the organizational level in economic development to get ready to respond to the situation that's coming.
We're already seeing this innovation in other nonprofits at the sub-state level, United Ways, for example, and other service organizations, how they're considering consolidating or sharing resources in very different ways.
And this is Rob. I guess I would add to this discussion, I do think what we've been saying in Michigan is the state whose small businesses, at least in this really short term, take advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, take advantage of those resources. The state that does that best will recover sooner. Its small businesses will recover quicker and more thoroughly. So I worry that there is a winners and losers scenario playing out for reasons that have nothing to do with what they used to have to do with. I think it's important for us to pay attention to that.
Yeah, and we don't know if those winners and losers are picked by anyone. I don't think it's a matter of anybody picking. I think it's the unintended consequences of, situations that have been created, whether it's the PPP running out of funding, the banks deciding which ones go through, all these things are impacting that survival that you're talking about, the winners and losers. Rob?
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about the site selection model, business site selection model. And obviously over the course of the past year, 2 years, it's all been pretty much based on the discussion of workforce, availability of workforce, cost of workforce, proximity of workforce, transferability of skill sets per workforce. Clearly now we're going to have to pivot away from that dialogue and that narrative and more towards helping the companies that are still in business, obviously attracting new business to try and provide jobs for those who lost their job. But where I'm going with this question is, do you see a fundamental shift in the site selection piece where a cost of labor and cost of energy, cost of infrastructure, taxation, incentives, all those kind of pillar elements that went into a site selection model, as we know, are all meant to mitigate against risk. But now what we're seeing is something, the black swan of site selection, which is now these health issues and the pandemic that came along. Will the medical community now be expected to play a part in the site visit, much in the same way the institutions of higher education do, a lot of local stakeholders do? Will companies now want to have a meeting with the local authorities responsible for pandemic response? Are companies going to want to see, well, if this happens again, what do we have here to mitigate against risk? Do we have a centralized site for testing? Do we have enough material stockpiled for testing? So what are your thoughts on that? Is this going to be are we going to see a long-term effect on this on site selection and business location?
This is Bob. I think there's going to be a threshold that everybody's going to have to meet in that space to compete, period. And then after that, I think much like these other factors you mentioned in the previous model, I think to the extent that you can be more robust in that public health space and create pro-business, procedures and policies, that could be advantageous.
So is that now a community's? I'm sorry?
I'd just like to say,
Graham, is that you?
Yeah, this is Graham here. One thing we haven't talked about, and I think we're all assuming that this is the beginning of the end. That now that we're starting to open up our economies, things will gradually get better. Maybe slow, but it'll be gradual. It may be just the end of a beginning, in the sense that if we do not have the medical solutions fairly quickly, especially in terms of vaccine, by the next season, it's very likely there'll be recurrences. So I would think that as a prospecting entity, I would think that I would want to look at what the capabilities are and the sensitivities are of an area to respond to another outbreak.
Right. Agreed. 100%.
Which also makes it much more regional, I think. Before we mentioned, it matters, are there going to be states that are going to move first? Is there going to be first mover advantage? But I think the states that are actually, we've seen some states actually having regional differences even in some of those restrictions. And I think the states are going to allow their regions that are so diverse, talking about a laboratory. I mean, it is really, site selectors, yes, sometimes they go and companies look and say, we're going to definitely be at the East Coast, and then they go down which state, and then they go down where in the state. But I think the states that are going to allow within their borders some experimentation to really let everybody else figure out how they best respond with, obviously the support they need. I think that's going to highlight as well, what you can make out of your region. It's going to let you experiment a bit more on what works for your setup and your history and your organizations, and that's going to be important as well.
Right.
Absolutely. So it would be very reasonable to assume that moving into the future, a regional economic development organization, a county, even a state could use as a unique selling proposition the fact that they have a plan, an infrastructure in place to mitigate against this kind of event happening again, to keep businesses open. As we know, the site selection practice revolves almost exclusively around risk mitigation. So I don't know how today we can imagine that this being one of the biggest risks we've ever come across wouldn't be part of some sort of a strategy moving forward, where economic development organizations would want to put their best foot forward in showing how they've taken this situation seriously and prepared for the future.
Right.
Okay. Well, we're closing in on the final moments of the webinar, and so with that being said, over the course of the seminar in totality, I guess probably the one question that we've received the most is, how can I get a copy of this webinar? So I threw up this slide. Anybody who would like to get a copy of the webinar, please email me, steve@Gazelle.ai. Also, what I might mention at the same time is, for those of you who might not be aware, we've been offering a special, I won't call it a promotion, but a special offer whereby economic development organizations who can benefit from accessing supply chain data and companies that are directly linked to different pieces of the supply chain, we have that all mapped out in our Gazelle.ai platform. So we've been providing with economic development organizations free access to the platform, specifically as it relates to trying to better understand supply chain and the different companies around the world who are involved in any given part of a supply chain. So if this would be interesting to you to access some of that data, it's being offered again on a complimentary basis. So please email me, steve@Gazelle.ai, if you'd like to discuss getting onto the platform and seeing if it can help you in your community. Or also, please feel free to email me if you want a copy of the presentation. I think by normal way of business, IEDC probably sends out the recording to all of the registrants, but if for some reason that's not happening, I'll make sure that all those that want a copy will get a copy. So with all that being said, once again, I'd like to take a moment to express my sincerest thank you to all of the panelists who took time out of their very busy schedules and this very busy time for them in helping in their own communities to put together these slides and participate in today's webinar. I'd like to thank Erica from IEDC, Shari from IEDC, who helped out tremendously. I'd also like to thank, again, the Gazelle.ai and ROI teams who put together a lot of the data that are in the slide presentations, particularly for me. And thank you, everybody who participated in the webinar. We had over 800, I think close to 900 people register. So this is obviously a subject matter that's of keen interest to the economic development community. I hope we provided some answers to the questions that you have. We'll be putting on other webinars. We'll be doing some deeper dives. So please feel free to send me any subject matter that would be of interest to you, and I'll try and get a webinar put together ASAP based on your suggestions. So that's it for now. So thank you very much again. Please stay safe, and we look forward to speaking to you again in the very short term. Thank you.